Every year, it started the same way. December would arrive, and with it, that familiar feeling I tried to ignore. The lights would go up in the neighborhood. Stores would fill with red and green decorations. People would start talking about plans, who was hosting, who was traveling, who was bringing dessert. And every year, I waited. Not for gifts. Not for money. Not for attention. Just for an invitation. A message. A call. A simple, "Christmas is at our place this year." But every year, that message never came. I told myself not to expect it. I reminded myself that I was grown, independent, busy. I didn't need family gatherings to feel whole. That's what I told myself, at least. Still, I always kept Christmas free. Just in case. By mid-December, family group chats would slowly come alive. At first, harmless things, memes, random updates, old photos. Nothing about plans yet. I'd scroll quietly, reading but rarely responding, waiting to see if someone would finally say it. The invitation. Days passed. Nothing. By December 23rd, the silence became louder. I'd catch myself checking my phone without realizing it. Not obsessively, just enough to feel disappointed each time the screen stayed quiet. I hated that about myself. I hated that after all these years, I still hoped. Christmas Eve arrived. December 24th. The day everyone pretends is calm but secretly revolves around timing. When to arrive, what to wear, who's bringing what. I woke up that morning with a strange mix of hope and resignation. Maybe today. Maybe this year would be different. I went about my day like normal. Cleaned the apartment. Did laundry. Made coffee and let it go cold on the counter while I stared out the window. Every buzz from my phone made my heart jump slightly, only to fall again when it turned out to be an ad or a notification that meant nothing. By afternoon, I knew. No call. No text. No, "What time can you come?" Again. I opened the family group chat. Photos were already there. Someone had posted a picture of wrapped gifts stacked in a corner. Another message followed. "Can't wait for tonight." Heart emojis. Laughing emojis. No one mentioned me. No one asked if I was coming. No one even pretended to wonder. That hurt more than being told no. Because it wasn't rejection. It was erasure. I tried to tell myself it wasn't personal. I replayed the usual excuses in my head before anyone even said them out loud. They probably assumed I was busy. They didn't want to pressure me. It just slipped their minds. Funny how it always slipped their minds. Every year. I sat on the edge of my bed and held my phone in my hands, staring at the screen like it might suddenly change its mind. Like a message might magically appear if I waited long enough. It didn't. That's when the familiar ache settled in, a dull, quiet pain that didn't explode, didn't scream, just stayed. The kind that makes you feel small without anyone ever raising their voice. I thought about past Christmases. Times I had been invited, but only after asking. Times I arrived late because no one told me when dinner started. Times I felt like a guest instead of family, hovering near the edges of conversations, unsure where I belonged. I remembered smiling anyway. Laughing at jokes. Helping clean up. Pretending it didn't matter. Because saying something felt worse than staying quiet. Because I didn't want to be difficult. Or too sensitive. Or dramatic. So I learned to swallow it. Year after year. By early evening, the house felt unbearably quiet. Outside, I could hear distant laughter drifting from neighboring homes. Cars pulling up. Doors opening and closing. Families gathering. I stood in my kitchen, opened the fridge, then closed it again. I wasn't hungry. Not really. But I knew if I didn't do something, anything, I'd spend the night sitting on the couch, scrolling through photos of a life I wasn't invited into. That's when I grabbed my keys. I didn't think much. I just left. The store was busy in that last-minute holiday way. People rushing through aisles, grabbing forgotten items, complaining lightly about crowds. Couples arguing over which dessert to buy. Parents bribing tired kids with candy. I walked through it all like a ghost. Then I saw it. A shelf near the camping section. Mountain house meals. Emergency food. Long shelf life. Add hot water and wait. I picked one up and stared at it longer than necessary. It wasn't festive. It wasn't comforting. But it was honest. This wasn't a Christmas dinner. This was survival. I bought it. Not because I wanted it, but because it meant I was done waiting. Back home, I set the bag on the counter and leaned against it, breathing slowly. The apartment felt different now, not sad, just still. Like it was waiting to see what I'd do next. I didn't check my phone again. I boiled water and listened to the sound fill the room. Steam rose, clouding the air, softening the edges of everything. When I poured the water into the pouch, it felt strangely ceremonial, like I was marking an ending. I sat down at the table alone. No candles. No music. No photos. Just me and that simple meal. As I ate, the memories came back uninvited. Every time I'd been told, "Oh, we thought you knew." Every time I laughed it off and said, "It's okay." Every time I told myself next year would be better. This year taught me something painful. I wasn't being forgotten by accident. I was being forgotten because it was easy. And sitting there, in that quiet kitchen, I finally admitted the truth I'd avoided for years. I kept showing up for people who didn't show up for me. That realization didn't make me cry. It made me tired. Tired of hoping. Tired of waiting. Tired of shrinking myself to fit into spaces that never made room. When I finished eating, I pushed the pouch aside and sat back in my chair. My phone lay face down on the table. I didn't flip it over. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for Christmas to include me. I was choosing myself instead. And they had no idea. This Christmas was the beginning of something they wouldn't notice until it was gone. The water finished boiling, and the kitchen fell quiet again. That strange kind of quiet, the kind that feels louder than noise. I carried the pouch to the table and sat down slowly, like if I moved too fast, something inside me might break. The chair scraped softly against the floor, and the sound echoed more than it should have. I realized then how empty the room really was. No extra plates stacked on the counter. No smells of different dishes mixing together. No voices overlapping, arguing about recipes or politics or old stories everyone pretends they haven't heard 100 times before. Just one chair. Mine. I ate slowly, not because the food was special, but because there was nowhere to rush to. No schedule. No expectations. No moment where someone would suddenly say, "Come on, sit, we're starting." Halfway through the meal, I stopped tasting it. My mind drifted. I thought about how many times I'd imagined Christmas differently. A full table. Someone calling my name from the kitchen. Being handed a plate without having to ask. Small things that somehow meant everything. I remembered being younger, when being left out felt confusing instead of painful. Back then, I assumed there must have been a mistake. Someone forgot to tell me. Someone would realize and fix it. As the years passed, confusion turned into habit. I learned how to act unbothered. How to smile when people talked about events I wasn't part of. How to pretend I didn't care when photos appeared online hours before anyone remembered to message me. That pretending takes energy. More than people realize. I looked at my phone on the table, face down, and resisted the urge to flip it over. Part of me still expected a message to appear, late, casual, effortless. "Oh hey, are you coming?" I hated that part of myself. Because even now, after everything, some small piece of me still hoped. Outside, headlights passed by the window. Cars slowing down, pulling into driveways. Doors opening. Voices greeting each other. Life continuing, just not with me in it. I stood up and walked to the window. Across the street, a family gathered in their living room. I could see them through the curtains, slightly blurred. Someone handed out drinks. Someone else leaned in for a hug. A child ran past, too fast to see clearly. I wasn't jealous. I was tired. Tired of wondering what was wrong with me. Tired of measuring my worth by how often I was remembered. Tired of pretending that being alone on days like this didn't sting. I realized something important then. Loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about feeling invisible while surrounded by people who are supposed to see you. I went back to the table and sat down again. The pouch was empty now. The meal was over, but the night wasn't. Usually, this was the time I'd distract myself. Movies, scrolling, background noise to fill the silence. But that night, I let the quiet stay. And in that quiet, I started hearing my own thoughts clearly for the first time. Why did I keep trying so hard for people who didn't meet me halfway? Why did I always explain their behavior for them? They didn't mean it. They're just busy. Next time will be different. Next time never came. Another memory surfaced, one I hadn't thought about in years. A Christmas when I finally asked, "What time should I come?" The pause on the other end of the phone. The awkward tone. The rushed answer. I remembered how small I felt hanging up. That was the moment I should have paid attention to. Because people who want you there don't make it feel like a favor. They make it feel natural. I picked up my phone again, not to check messages, but to turn it completely off. The screen went dark, and with it, a weight lifted from my chest. No more waiting. No more hoping. That night, I cleaned the kitchen slowly. Washed the cup. Threw away the empty pouch. Each small action felt grounding, like I was reclaiming something simple but important. When everything was clean, I sat on the couch with a blanket and stared at the ceiling. I didn't cry. I thought I would. But instead, I felt something else, acceptance. Not the kind that says, "This is fine," but the kind that says, "This is real." And once you accept reality, you can finally stop fighting it. I understood then that this Christmas wasn't a tragedy. It was a turning point. Because for the first time, I wasn't blaming myself for being forgotten. I was seeing the truth clearly. And that truth, as painful as it was, came with a strange sense of peace. I fell asleep that night without setting an alarm, without checking my phone one last time. Outside, the world kept celebrating. Inside, something quietly ended. And something else, something stronger, began. I woke up late the next morning. Not because I had stayed up late, but because there was no reason to wake up early. No schedule. No plans. No obligation to show up somewhere and pretend everything was normal. For a moment, I forgot what day it was. Then I remembered. Christmas morning. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. It felt different now, not heavy, not sharp. Just present. Like the house was breathing slowly around me. When I finally got out of bed, the apartment looked exactly the same as the night before. Clean. Still. Unchanged. But something in me had shifted. I made coffee and sat at the table, letting my thoughts wander without pushing them away. And that's when the pattern became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just Christmas. It never was. It was birthdays where I waited all day for a message that arrived late, if at all. It was family dinners planned in side conversations, mentioned casually after they'd already happened. It was trips and celebrations I learned about through photos, not invitations. Always after. Always second-hand. I replayed conversations in my head. Times I'd said, "Oh, I didn't know," and someone replied, "Really? I thought you did." Times I laughed it off, even when the laugh felt forced. At some point, forgetting me had become normal. And I had helped make it that way. That thought was uncomfortable. Because it meant I wasn't just a victim of circumstance. I was participating, by staying quiet, by accepting excuses, by convincing myself that asking for inclusion was somehow selfish. I had trained people how to treat me. I realized how often I'd made myself small to keep the peace. How many times I'd adjusted my life around the possibility of being included, even when inclusion rarely came. I kept my schedule open. I avoided making firm plans. I stayed available. Just in case. Just in case someone remembered. That just in case had shaped years of my life. And for what? To be optional. The realization hit harder than I expected. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. I thought about the people in my family individually, who reached out first, who never did, who only responded when I initiated. Patterns emerged there too. Effort flowed in one direction. Mine. And that's when it became clear, This wasn't about being forgotten. It was about being convenient. I wasn't excluded out of malice. I was excluded because no one had to work to keep me around. I was always there, always understanding, always quiet. Silence is easy to overlook. I stood up and walked around the apartment, touching small, familiar things, the back of the chair, the edge of the counter, the window frame. Grounding myself. I felt grief, but not the kind that comes with anger. This was grief for the version of myself who kept hoping things would change without changing anything. I thought about how much emotional energy I'd spent trying to decode other people's behavior instead of listening to what it was telling me plainly. They weren't confused. They were comfortable. Comfortable with my absence. That truth hurt. But it also brought relief. Because once you stop lying to yourself, you can finally move forward. I realized I didn't want an apology. I didn't want explanations. I wanted respect. And respect starts with how you treat yourself. That morning, I made a quiet promise, not dramatic, not spoken out loud. I would stop begging for a place at tables that didn't set a chair for me. I would stop shrinking to fit into spaces that never expanded. And most importantly, I would stop confusing endurance with loyalty. Loyalty shouldn't hurt. As the day went on, messages appeared in the group chat. More photos. More laughter. Still no mention of me. And for the first time, I didn't feel that familiar twist in my chest. I felt distance. Not bitterness. Distance. The healthy kind. I muted the chat. Not out of anger. Out of care, for myself. That decision felt small. But it changed everything. Because patterns only control you until you see them clearly. And now, I did. I didn't open the family group chat that afternoon. Not because I was angry. But because I already knew what I'd find. Still, avoidance has limits. And sometime after sunset, when the sky turned that deep winter blue that feels heavier than night, I picked up my phone again. One notification. Family group chat. My thumb hovered over the screen longer than it should have. I told myself I didn't care. That I had already made peace with everything. But peace doesn't arrive all at once. I opened the chat. And there it was. A photo. The familiar dining table. Plates arranged neatly. Glasses half full. Everyone squeezed in close, leaning toward the camera like gravity pulled them together. Smiles everywhere. Real smiles. The kind that don't come from obligation. Underneath it, a caption. So grateful for family red heart # Christmas tree. I stared at that heart emoji for a long time. Not because it hurt more than everything else. But because it confirmed something I had been avoiding for years. They didn't forget. They chose. The room around me felt suddenly distant, like I was underwater. Sounds dulled. My breath slowed. I zoomed in on the photo without meaning to, studying details I didn't need to see. Who sat where? Who leaned toward whom? Who looked comfortable? There was no empty chair. No sign that someone was missing. I looked for myself out of habit. That realization landed quietly, but firmly. I wasn't part of this picture. Not as a mistake. Not as an oversight. As a decision. I scrolled up, half expecting a follow-up message. Wish you were here. Next time. We'll get together soon. Nothing. The photo stood alone. Complete. I locked my phone and set it face down on the table. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I had imagined this moment many times. How it would feel if I finally saw proof that I was being excluded on purpose. I always thought it would shatter me. Instead, it clarified everything. Pain thrives on uncertainty. Truth, even when it hurts, brings relief. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the air carried that sharp cold that settles into your bones. A car drove by slowly, music playing faintly inside. Somewhere else, people were laughing. Here, I was alone. But for the first time, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt released. Because I finally understood something I had been pretending not to see. I had been holding on to the idea of family, not the reality of it. I had loved a version of them that existed mostly in my head. A version where inclusion was natural, where my presence mattered, where silence meant nothing. The photo shattered that illusion. And once it broke, it couldn't be repaired. I sat back down at the table and picked up my phone again. I opened the photo one last time, not to torture myself, but to acknowledge it. This is what is. No denial. No excuses. Just truth. I thought about all the times I'd defended them to myself. All the energy I'd spent making sense of behavior that never made sense because it wasn't accidental. I realized how often I'd apologized, for being busy, for living far away, for not checking in enough, when no one ever apologized to me. That imbalance had become normal. Seeing it clearly hurt. But it also freed me from responsibility that was never mine. I didn't owe them understanding anymore. I owed myself honesty. I typed a message in the chat. Then erased it. I typed another. Deleted that too. There was nothing I could say that wouldn't come from a place of hurt, and I didn't want to give that hurt a voice there. Silence, this time, wasn't weakness. It was choice. I muted the chat again. Permanently. That night, I didn't distract myself. I didn't turn on a movie or scroll endlessly. I let the quiet sit with me, even when it felt uncomfortable. Grief came in waves. Not grief for missing dinner. Grief for the years I spent hoping things would be different. Grief for the younger version of me who kept showing up, even when it hurt. But grief doesn't mean regret. It means recognition. And with recognition came resolve. I understood something deeply that night. You can't heal in the same place that keeps hurting you. Family or not. The photo didn't break me. It ended something that had already been breaking me for years. And once it ended, there was space. Space to build something new. Something honest. Something chosen. That night, before going to bed, I placed my phone in a drawer instead of on the nightstand. I didn't want it to be the first thing I saw in the morning. I wanted to wake up to myself. Because after seeing that photo, I knew. This chapter was over. And for the first time, I was ready to turn the page. Nothing changed the next day. And that, somehow, mattered the most. No messages asking if I was okay. No late apologies. No awkward follow-ups. The world continued exactly as it always had. That's when I understood something important. The decision I had made the night before wasn't meant to be seen. It wasn't for them. It was for me. I went about my day slowly, deliberately, paying attention to how I felt without the constant background noise of expectation. I made breakfast and ate it at the table instead of standing in the kitchen. I drank my coffee while it was still hot. Small things, but intentional. I didn't check the family chat. Not out of anger, but because I no longer needed updates from a space that had quietly made room without me. That choice felt strange at first, like stepping off a path I'd walked for years. My instincts still told me to check, to stay aware, to remain available. I ignored them. And nothing bad happened. That surprised me. Over the next few days, I noticed how much of my life had been shaped around the possibility of inclusion. How often I'd said maybe instead of yes or no. How rarely I made firm plans because I didn't want to seem unavailable if someone suddenly remembered me. I started changing that. When friends asked if I was free, I gave real answers. When I wanted to rest, I rested. When I wanted to go somewhere, I went, without waiting to see if anyone else would join. No announcements. No explanations. Just quiet shifts. I didn't confront my family. Not because I was afraid, but because I realized confrontation wouldn't give me what I needed. It might create noise, but not change. What I needed was distance, not emotional distance born of resentment, but healthy distance born of clarity. Weeks passed. Birthdays came and went. Conversations stayed polite and surface level. No one mentioned Christmas. No one asked why I'd gone quiet. And that told me everything. Because when you stop showing up the way people expect, the ones who care will ask why. The others won't notice. I wasn't angry about that. I was relieved. For the first time, I wasn't over-explaining myself. I wasn't trying to be understood by people who had never tried to understand me. I was choosing dignity over familiarity. And dignity doesn't need an audience. One evening, as I sat alone with a book and a cup of tea, I realized something that made me smile softly. I felt lighter. Not because my life was suddenly perfect, but because I wasn't carrying the weight of hoping anymore. The decision I made that Christmas night didn't change my family. It changed me. And that was enough. Time didn't heal everything, but it softened the sharp edges. The weeks after Christmas blended into months, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't measuring time by family events. I wasn't counting invitations or reading between lines. I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment disguised as politeness. I was just living. At first, that felt unfamiliar. Almost irresponsible. Like I was forgetting a duty I'd carried for years without realizing it had weight. I filled my days slowly. Mornings became quieter. I developed small rituals that belonged only to me, stretching before sunrise, music playing low while I cooked, walks taken without a destination. I stopped rushing through moments as if something else was waiting to claim them. Nothing was. And that was the point. I noticed how often I had once shaped myself around others' comfort. How I'd softened opinions, swallowed reactions, edited stories. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I learned that staying agreeable made me easier to keep around. Or so I thought. Without that pressure, my voice changed. It didn't get louder, it got steadier. I spoke when I meant something. I stayed silent when I didn't. I stopped performing emotional availability for people who treated it like background noise. Friends noticed first. "You seem different," one of them said during a late dinner. "Calmer." I didn't know how to explain that calm isn't something you gain, it's something you stop giving away. I started creating boundaries without calling them that. I declined gatherings I didn't want to attend. I left conversations that felt draining. I stopped answering messages immediately, not as punishment, but as permission to exist at my own pace. Nothing dramatic happened. No one confronted me. No one demanded explanations. Life simply adjusted. And that taught me another truth. People often take what you offer, not because they're cruel, but because they assume it's endless. I learned to make myself finite. Spring arrived quietly. The air warmed. Days stretched longer. I rearranged my living space, not because I needed change, but because I wanted it to reflect who I was becoming. I donated things tied to versions of myself that no longer fit. There was grief in that. Letting go isn't painless, even when it's right. Some nights, memories still surfaced. Laughter I used to chase. Rooms I once tried to belong in. I allowed myself to miss them without wanting them back. That distinction mattered. Belonging, I realized, isn't about proximity or shared blood. It's about presence. About being seen without having to announce yourself. I began to build new traditions. Sunday mornings at a cafe where no one knew my history. Evening walks where the same stranger nodded hello each day. Holidays spent traveling, or resting, or doing nothing at all. Each choice was quiet. But together, they formed a life. Then one afternoon, months later, I received a message. A casual one. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just an update. I read it once, then set my phone down. And for the first time, I didn't feel pulled to respond. That's when I knew I'd changed. Not because I was distant, but because I was complete. I had learned how to belong, to myself. And once you do that, everything else becomes optional. I didn't notice the change at first. That's the thing about shifts in power, they don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with speeches or confrontations. They happen quietly, in the absence of something that used to be there. Me. Months passed before my absence became noticeable. Not because I was important, but because I had always been available. I filled gaps. I responded quickly. I showed up without being asked twice. When that stopped, there was a pause. At first, it was subtle. A delayed message. A question that didn't quite land. A "did you see this?" sent into a silence that no longer rushed to answer. Then came the confusion. Plans were made and suddenly felt incomplete. Conversations ended earlier than expected. There was no one smoothing over tension, no one quietly agreeing to keep things comfortable. I wasn't punishing them. I was simply gone. And absence has a way of rearranging rooms. One evening, I received a call I hadn't expected. The name on the screen belonged to someone who never called unless they needed something. I let it ring. Not out of bitterness, but because I was busy living a life that didn't revolve around reacting. When I returned the call later, the conversation was polite. Careful. As if they were stepping into unfamiliar territory. "You've been busy," they said. I smiled softly. "Yes." That was all. No explanations. No apologies. No emotional handover. The dynamic shifted right there. Because for the first time, they were the ones reaching. Not to include me, but to understand why I was no longer reaching back. I didn't offer clarity. Not because I wanted to withhold, but because clarity had never been requested before. They were used to my availability, not my honesty. And honesty, I learned, can be overwhelming when people haven't earned it. Over time, the tone changed. Messages became warmer. Invitations more direct. My presence, once assumed, was now requested. "Are you coming? Will you be there? Let us know." I noticed something else too. No one joked about forgetting anymore. Because forgetting only works when someone is willing to remind you. I attended a family gathering months later. Not out of obligation, but curiosity. I wanted to see what had changed. They looked surprised when I arrived. Not because they didn't want me there, but because they hadn't expected me to say yes. I was different. Not colder. Not distant. Just self-contained. I listened more than I spoke. I stayed present without performing. I left when I wanted to. And something remarkable happened. They treated me differently. With care. With attention. With respect they didn't realize they'd been withholding. Not because they suddenly understood everything, but because I had changed the rules. I was no longer someone they could overlook and assume would return unchanged. I had become someone who chose. And choice commands a different kind of regard. Driving home that night, I didn't feel victorious. I felt peaceful. Because the power shift wasn't about them realizing my worth. It was about me no longer negotiating it. Silence had reached them, not as punishment, but as truth. And truth, once felt, cannot be unfelt. The next Christmas arrived without tension. That surprised me. There was no knot in my chest when December began. No mental countdown to disappointment. No quiet dread hiding behind festive decorations. For the first time, Christmas felt neutral. And neutrality, I learned, can be a gift. I didn't wait for an invitation. I didn't scan messages for hints. I made plans early, real plans. The kind that don't depend on anyone remembering you exist. I booked a small cabin a few hours away. Nothing fancy. Just snow, silence, and a fireplace that crackled like it had stories of its own. A week before Christmas, a message arrived. Simple. Direct. "We're getting together on the 25th. You're welcome if you'd like to come." No guilt. No assumption. No pressure. I sat with that message for a long time. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to notice how it felt to choose. I replied honestly. "I already have plans. Thank you for thinking of me." And I meant both parts. On Christmas morning, I woke to quiet snowfall. The kind that makes the world feel softer, slower. I brewed coffee and watched the sky change colors through the window. No rushing. No performance. No proving anything. I cooked a meal I actually enjoyed. I played music I loved. I called one person who had shown up consistently, without reminders or expectations. We laughed. Later, as the fire burned low, I thought about past Christmases. The longing, the waiting, the feeling of standing just outside a door that never fully opened. I realized something important. Those doors hadn't been locked. They just weren't meant for me anymore. And that was okay. Belonging doesn't require endurance. It requires reciprocity. That evening, I received a few messages. Warm ones. Thoughtful ones. Not frantic. Not obligatory. They didn't sting. Because I no longer needed them to define my holiday. This Christmas wasn't about absence or rejection. It was about presence. My own. And as the night settled in, I felt something I'd never felt on Christmas before. Contentment. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just real. Forgiveness didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, in pieces. Not as a decision I made one morning, but as something that unfolded when I stopped rehearsing old conversations in my head. When memories lost their sharp edges. When the past stopped asking to be rewritten. I used to think forgiveness meant reopening doors. It doesn't. Sometimes it means finally locking them, without anger. I noticed the change in myself during ordinary moments. When a familiar name appeared on my phone and my heart didn't race. When a passing comment about family didn't trigger a defensive explanation. When I could talk about my childhood without editing the truth or protecting anyone's image. That freedom felt strange at first. Like walking without armor. I realized I no longer needed validation from people who had never learned how to offer it. Their limitations were no longer personal failures I had to compensate for. They were simply limits. And limits don't require arguments. They require acceptance. I thought about the younger version of myself, the one who kept waiting to be chosen. The one who believed love was something you earned by being patient, understanding, convenient. I wished I could tell them this. You don't have to disappear to be kept. You don't have to be quiet to belong. You don't have to accept crumbs because you're afraid of losing the table. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't for them. It was for me. It was releasing the hope that one day they'd become different people. Kinder. More attentive. More aware. That hope had kept me tethered longer than any rejection ever did. Once I let it go, I felt lighter than I ever had. I didn't cut ties dramatically. I didn't announce boundaries. I simply stopped reaching for what wasn't reaching back. And in that space, something new formed. Peace. Not the kind that demands understanding. The kind that exists without explanation. I could wish them well without wishing myself smaller. I could remember good moments without denying the truth. I could hold compassion without reopening wounds. That balance was freedom. As months passed, I noticed something else. I had more energy, more patience, more room. Because I wasn't spending it all on managing disappointment. I was living forward. And that's when I knew. Forgiveness doesn't mean going back. It means finally being able to walk away without looking over your shoulder. I don't tell this story often. Not because it hurts, but because it no longer defines me. There was a time when being forgotten felt like a verdict. Like proof that I was somehow less important, less lovable, less worthy of effort. I carried that belief quietly, letting it shape the way I showed up in rooms, conversations, relationships. I didn't realize I was shrinking myself. Not all at once. Just enough to fit where I wasn't truly held. That Christmas, the one with the mountain house meal and the silent house, wasn't the worst moment of my life. It was the clearest. Clarity doesn't scream. It sits with you, calmly, until you're ready to listen. What followed wasn't revenge or dramatic independence. It was something far more difficult. Consistency. I chose myself every day in small, unremarkable ways. I built routines that didn't depend on approval. I made decisions without asking if they were acceptable. I stopped measuring my worth by how much effort others put in. And slowly, my life expanded. I formed relationships that felt mutual, where presence wasn't a favor and care wasn't conditional. I learned the difference between being included and being valued. One doesn't require effort. The other requires intention. I no longer chase holidays or milestones. I create meaning where I am. I honor my time. I protect my energy. I show up fully where I'm welcomed, and step back quietly where I'm not. There's no anger in that. Just wisdom. Sometimes, people from my past still reach out. Politely. Carefully. As if unsure of where they stand. I treat them with kindness. But I don't rearrange myself anymore. Because love that costs you your dignity is too expensive. If there's one thing I learned, it's this. Being forgotten doesn't mean you're forgettable. Sometimes, It means you were giving too much to people who never learned how to hold it. I didn't lose my family. I found myself. And that changed everything.